What's up and welcome to Albino Rhino Music, and today we're going to look at, if you like the Beatles, then check out these bands.
I like riding my bike at night because I get burned in the broad daylight. I'm just a fly down Rhino trying to get home.
Obviously, the Beatles, historically, in my opinion, and many people's opinion, are one of the greatest rock bands of all time. So when I say check these bands out, I'm not saying these bands are as good as the Beatles. I mean, I may have opinions on some of them that I really love, some of the bands I'm going to talk about, and I think they're fantastic, but I'm not trying to say they're as good as the Beatles. You're going to love them the same way. I'm just trying to take bands and specifically focus as much as I can on bands that are still making music. However, I will talk about some older ones since the Beatles were making music 50, 60 years ago. There have been many bands that were influenced by them or picked up sounds and stuff. So I'll probably have some bands that sound like certain time periods of the Beatles, other bands sound like other time periods, and maybe a band that just kind of encompasses the whole Beatles vibe and stuff like that. So just take that, as a disclaimer that I'm not saying these bands are going to be as blow your skirt up as much as the Beatles do. So this first band that we're going to look at is a band called the Lemon Twigs, and they are currently making music, and they just had this album, The Look for Your Mind, come out, which is fantastic. They've had 5 different albums, I believe, so far under the Lemon Twigs. They're 2 brothers, Brian and Michael D'Addario. If you recognize that name, it could be for 2 reasons. One, their dad, Ronnie D'Addario, was a famous power pop and pop singer and musician in the 70s. And he's worked with his boys to with this band, the Lemon Twigs, and producing them and stuff. And it's clear they're highly inspired by him and by music from the 60s. They really encompass that sound. I mean, when you play it, and I'm going to say this multiple times about some of these bands, it has a warmth to it. The way when you put on a record or something from the 60s or early 70s, and it has this warmth to it. I don't know how else to say that, except for the way that it sounds, and I feel like you'll know it when you hear it. It doesn't sound crappy, because I don't think a lot of music that was made in the 60s and 70s was not all of it was produced crappy just because it's old. A lot of more current music sounds more manufactured than that. And so there's something that this band embraces and encompasses with their recording style and the way things sound. They definitely have a more of a acoustic, folksy rock sound at times, like the Beatles meet the Byrds, or something like that, kind of. But Look for Your Mind was awesome. I mean, I liked their other stuff. Their album before that, I think it came out in 2023 or 2024, called A Dream Is All We Know, and that album is really cool too. But Look for Your Mind's awesome. Oh, I was going to say Ronnie D'Addario, their dad, but you also may recognize that name if you play guitar from the D'Addario Strings, which it's another branch of their dad's family. Somewhere in their family, in the 1930s, they came from Italy and to America, and they created the guitar string company D'Addario. So they are in some way related to that string manufacturing company, which is a great string as well. So this next band we're going to talk about is a band called Badfinger. Now this is, like I said, not all these bands are going to be current. I really wanted to do them, but there's some I had to talk about. This band got big in the 1970s, 1971. In fact, they were kind of known as they were the predecessors to the Beatles, the next Fab Four. Paul McCartney helped write one of their big hits. They were the first band signed by Apple Corp Studios, which is where the Beatles, played their last show, on the roof of Apple Corp. And this was the first band kind of signed by them. George Harrison worked with them in production of some songs, and they worked with John Lennon on his Imagine album. So, I mean, they worked really closely with the Beatles, which makes sense of why they got this Beatles vibe. If you grew up with the Beatles, you probably know this band, and you recognize the name, and you remember the name. If you're my age or younger, then you may have no idea who this band is, but you may know songs that you don't realize you know from them. Or you may not know them at all, and that's why I want to talk about them. I mean, for people, especially people my age and younger than me, that may not realize who this band is and how awesome they are. They kind of, I feel like they kind of sound like the singer Pete Ham reminds me a lot of Paul McCartney at time, and they got the two guys that sing, him and Tom Evans, and I can't remember the other guy's name that sings some too, but they all, like, with the melodies and the harmonies that go together on their songs, it sounds like Paul and John when they would create melodies and harmonies together. Like, they don't sound like a ripoff, but it almost sounds like, is this did John and Paul start a new band? Like, you could, if you didn't know, you might think that. Like, this is very Beatles vibey, and it does not feel like a ripoff. It feels like a continuation of, like, Let It Be and Abbey Road, and where the Beatles would continue to go. Like, one of their biggest songs is No Matter What You Are. Like, that song, if you've ever heard it, you probably have. If you didn't realize, that's Badfinger. It's an awesome song. They have a song called Baby Blue, and I think that song was on the ending episode of Breaking Bad, the series finale, and that really, like, skyrocketed that. It's on this album straight up, the Baby Blue song, and then this other song, Day After Day. Day after day. Like, you probably know this song too and have heard it on the radio and maybe don't know who they are, but again, it feels like late Beatles just kind of continued. Those two songs are on this album straight up, and you totally need to check that out. The song that Paul helped them write was a song called Come and Get It. And you know these songs, but probably don't know the band if you're, like I said, you're my age or younger, and maybe even some older people don't realize who Badfinger is. But awesome. And they had such a tragic, sad story. The lead singer, Pete Ham, like, they basically had a manager who was, like, I don't know if he was tied to organized crime, but he was a piece of crap. And he essentially kind of screwed them over, and like, he was getting a ton already, and they were, like, had huge top 10 hits in their first couple albums, but they were still living together in a house with their wives and girlfriends. And then he, like, convinced Pete Ham, the singer, to go to Warner Brothers, I believe, instead of Apple Corp, and leave. And when he redid their contract, he, like, made sure he got even more and just screwed them out of money. I mean, they had huge songs, were working with the Beatles, but were poor and had nothing. And when they transferred to Warner Bros. Released albums the same time Apple Corp released their last album, which totally screwed them over and made things that they had fantastic songs on get overlooked. And it's just a tragic, sad story, because Pete Ham ended up taking his life when his wife was pregnant with their baby. He hung himself in the studio. He couldn't take it. He said his manager was a piece of trash, and he couldn't trust or love anyone again, and that this was better. And I think that was 75, and they kept trying to make music, but one of the other members, Jimmy or Jane, I can't remember his name, kind of screwed over this guy, Tom Evans, who was a big writer. Pete Ham and Tom Evans were the big songwriters of the band. And this Tom Evans guy just kept getting screwed over too. And in 1983, like 8 years after Pete Ham hung himself, he went outside and hung himself in his tree. His 6-year-old son found him. I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but it's just like a sad, tragic story of a band that should have been so much bigger than they are, and should have been making music for a long time. The next band I'm going to talk about is a band called Temples. This album called Sun Structures, the band Temples. This album's awesome. Again, kind of like the Lemon Twigs, but a little bit different, a little bit more. Still has this Beatles, Birds, the Animals kind of vibe, like this 60s sound to it. And I would say in the mid-2015s, this, like, sound, like the way this... again, you can only hear it if you listen to it. But this warmth that kind of got big with, like, indie/radio rock bands wanting to, like, I guess, go back to roots of making music. I don't know, but the sound that they got was amazing. And it sounds like those bands I mentioned, the Birds, the Beatles, the Animals, like with its harmonies and melodies and the guitar work and the sound that it has, the feel and the vibe of it. This like those like acoustic-y mixed with like a little psychedelic rock, but not too psychedelic, right? Like it's just really good. The opening track on the album is called Shelter Song, and that song is awesome. Sun Structures, the second song, is an amazing song. They've had about 5 albums now. In fact, in June, June of 2026, they have an album releasing called Bliss. And it has 3 songs already. If you like psychedelic music, you might like it, but I'm not saying it's psychedelic like Revolver and Sergeant Pepper's. Like, it's more modern psychedelic, I would say. But I guess because we're talking about them from that other album, I have to mention this one, because if you go and click on one of their other albums, you might be like, I don't really hear the Beatles. Sun Structures is where I think you could hear that kind of 60s rock sound mixed with some psychedelic. The new album Bliss, it's not terrible, but it reminds me more of like modern psychedelic, like that band that does like All the Other Kids with them pumped up kicks, where it feels like electronica mixed with like 60s psychedelia, but more leaning on that modern electronic kind of. But the album Sun Structures by Temples, that in particular encompasses this sound that I feel like is very 60s rock, very Beatles meets the Byrds. All right, the next band we're going to talk about is a band called Dr. Dog. Dr. Dog, Dr. Dog. Man, this is one of my favorite bands of all time. So while I have a bias to that, I'm not just picking them to talk about them. When I recommend this band to people and they're like, what does it sound like? And I'm like, man, think like the Beatles meets like indie rock. Right? Like, and no, I wouldn't even say like modern indie rock. It's just indie rock. It feels produced, self-produced, and not in a trash crap way. It feels recorded like the way there's a warmth to it. Here I go using that description again of a band, but there is a warmth to their recordings and their music. And they have a ton of albums. And honestly, again, this could be a biased opinion, you wouldn't go wrong starting anywhere in their discography. We All Belong is a fantastic album. They have this song called Keep a Friend on it. That was my wedding song that my wife and I danced to. When we were dating, I, nerdily sent her the lyrics to that song and told her basically that's how I felt about her. And so they have a special place in my heart. But man, I was loving Dr. Dog way before I even started dating my wife. I've seen them live tons of times, and they put on a fantastic show. They sound like they do on their albums, which is just an amazing feat. But it's fun. They're still making music. The album Fate is a huge, it's got this folksy, but then rock, and then I can't even begin to explain. It's like the Beatles, like all of the years of the Beatles encompassed in one, a lot of later Beatles vibes to it. And there's heavy pianos and acoustic guitars. And when I describe it, I can't even give it its due diligence of how good it is. But Fate is an amazing album, and I always tell people, it sounds like the Beatles. I'm not saying they sound like John and Paul when they sing. The bassist sings and the guitarist sings, and one of them has a much higher pitched voice. The other one has a more deeper, soulful kind of rasp to his voice, and they're both awesome in their own unique ways. And their harmonies in this band, the way all the musicians harmonize on songs is so Beatles vibey. It's amazing. Shame Shame is awesome. Be the Void, Be Room, all of those albums are awesome and embrace they have songs that sound like a more folksy Beatles songs that sound like a classic rockin' Beatles songs from like Abbey Road or the White Album. They have soulful songs, the Beatles have soulful songs and stuff like Oh Darling and stuff like that. They have this too. Then they have an album called Psychedelic Swamp, which definitely embraces more weirdness. It's still hooky and catchy and vibey and everything. It's got hooks for days, like the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, Revolver, their whole psychedelic era. They still hook you. When we did our Beatles tier list, we talked about how on Magical Mystery Tour, they like had songs that were like huge songs of theirs, but yet it was still like this psychedelic era. This psychedelic swamp is very much that. And their last 3 albums have been fan-freaking-tastic. Abandoned Mansions might be one of my favorite albums of theirs. That came out in 2017. And then in 2019 or 2018, they had an album, Critical Equation. And then they took the longest break of their career of making albums. And in 2024, they released a self-titled album called Dr. Dog, which is, again, amazing. I just don't think they have a bad album. I just think they're awesome, and I think their songs are incredible, like albums from beginning to end, like a lot of the Beatles albums that I can just put one of their albums on and listen to it, and I'm not pressing skip that often on Beatles albums, right? This band, Dr. Dog, is the same. Again, vocally don't necessarily sound like it, but the way they do melodies and harmonies is just so Beatlesy. You gotta check out Dr. Dog. All right, this next artist I'm going to talk about is a musician. His name is Mac DeMarco. So he's got a ton of albums, and unlike Dr. Dog, I like what I've heard, but I've only heard this one album called Salad Days. Came out in 2014, but the dude is still making, like, he prolifically is putting out music. I mean, he's from 2014 till now. He had an album come out in 2025. I think there's 11 albums in that from 2014 to 2025. So he's coming out with an album a year almost. But that Salad Days album, for sure. And I would kind of assume, I feel like I listened to a couple other songs, but not albums, and they kind of still have a lot of them have similar vibes. But it really reminds me of John Lennon. So it's got a Beatles vibe to it for sure, but also just like a John Lennon vibe. Like even John Lennon on his own after the post-Beatles, right? But just his vocals, like to me, he sounds like John Lennon sometimes. Not like a rip-off again, but he's got a John Lennon cadence and tone to his voice. Lennon is a little more, unique and odd sometimes in his song structures, and you feel this with this album Salad Days by Mac DeMarco. So very cool. So this next one is another like 1970s artist that's made a ton of music, and this one's like probably the biggest one I'm talking about. Badfinger had songs that everyone knows. In fact, this guy covered a Badfinger song called Without You. The song Without You, and again, probably another song you know, I can't live if living is without you. Like, he covered Harry Nilsson is his name. If I haven't said it, sorry. Harry Nilsson. And if again, that's a Badfinger song, and he covered it and it got huge for him. It's his most streamed song. But he's an awesome songwriter. I would say his music is very Magical Mystery Tour meets like acoustic-y white album type stuff. I'm sure there's tons of people that are older than me that are screaming at their phones, being like, well, you talked about Badfinger and Harry Nilsson. What about all these other bands from the 70s that sound like the Beatles, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm very sorry. I'm trying to go for things that, if I'm talking about an older thing, it's something maybe people that are young have not heard before. And so if I'm talking about more modern things, I'm trying to get anyone that loves the Beatles to listen to some modern, current music to help support these bands that are making music. But anyways, Harry Nilsson, very good. Very encompassing of a Beatles vibe. So here's my last band that's not currently making music as of right now. I have a couple other bands I'll talk about that are currently making music. But this band, not a 70s band, and when I say it, if you've heard them, you might be like, what? But it's a band called Ween, and they were very big in making music in the 90s and early 2000s. They have this like quirky, weird, trippy sound to them. Very musically diverse. Think like, I mean, from the, like throughout their whole catalog, very diverse. And think of, you know, Sergeant Pepper's, Revolver, Rubber Soul, Magical Mystery Tour, like White Album, like that whole thing. Maybe not even Magical Mystery Tour. There might be too much catchy stuff on that. White Album, very like musically diverse, weird, quirky, like this acousticy, vibey feel, but also rockin', psychedelic, just like all kinds of things. Their album Quebec is pretty awesome. It rocks. Like it really truly has like more of a and because some of their stuff has like more of a trippy vibe, soulful, bluesy vibe, like their album Chocolate and Cheese. And that is also awesome. It's chocolate and cheese or cheese and chocolate. It's one of those, and it's very cool. Quebec has more of a like this the rockier songs that I feel like on White Album that rock and stuff. They have more of that kind of vibe to it. They also have an album called The Mollusk, which was influenced by SpongeBob apparently. Which I think is the downfall and increase in ADD, ADHD through children in the 90s and 2000s. Thanks, SpongeBob, for that. Anyways, apparently highly like influenced by SpongeBob. It's weird. It's weird and trippy and stuff and quirky, definitely. But it's a really popular album of theirs, and there's songs on it that are cool. It's not one that I return to a lot, but again, you might like it if you like weird, odd music. So this band is a little bit, maybe somewhat of a stretch when it comes to sound, because like I said, vocally, you know, Ween doesn't sound quite like the Beatles. They don't necessarily completely embrace their sound, but they have such an eclectic sound, the way the Beatles do through their whole catalog. So Ween, a cool band from the 90s that I don't think gets enough credit. I don't return to them nearly as much as I would like the Beatles, but I'm just saying, if you haven't checked them out, you totally should. This next band we're going to talk about is called the Nude Party. This band's pretty awesome. Think like a folksier rockin' songs from the White Album or later Beatles folksier rockin' songs. They definitely have that vibe and feel to it. Their album, self-titled album, The Nude Party, came out in 2018, and it's an awesome album. They have the singer kind of encompasses John, Paul, and George all at the same time, while also a little bit of Bob Dylan. He has this like he's singing, but he's got this speaky singing thing happening at times that feels like Bob Dylan, maybe singing a little bit better than Bob Dylan though. I love Bob Dylan, but just saying, a lot of people issue is they say he can't sing, whatever. But it's like, you know, John, Paul, and George vocally meeting and mixing with Bob Dylan. And probably because they're like very like folksy, rock heavy, that it gives that Bob Dylan vibe mixed with the Beatles songs that remind me of that. But their self-titled album that came out in 2018, The Nude Party, they have a song called Chevrolet Van on that. Man, that is an awesome song. It's a perfect road trip driving song. And it is so good. That whole album is good. And it just, yeah, man, it encompasses that whole folksy vibe with the artist I talked about, mixed with a little like Wilco folksy sound. They don't sound like Wilco exactly, but I mean, I'm just saying like that it feels that when Wilco has more folksy songs, it's like all of those things combined. They had an album come out this year called Look Who's Back. Now I hate to say too much because I haven't got a ton of chance to listen to this one. The title track, Look Who's Back, is awesome. It's a very good song, and it sounds to me like I've listened to the album like once through, so I don't want to say too much about it. So obviously right now I'm kind of more partial to their self-titled album, but it still keeps that same vibe. They don't seem like they've changed. And I don't mean like they're not growing as musicians. I mean that sometimes people like totally change their sound, and it doesn't feel like that. It feels like it's still grabbing that sound that they've been going for with their career. So the Nude Party, check them out. So this last band we're going to talk about is a band called Cutworms. Their debut album, let's see, what was it called? Hollow Ground came out in 2018. That album's awesome. It's very cool. But they had a new album come out in March of this year that I've actually jammed quite a bit, called Transmitter. And this album is awesome. Very George Harrison. George Harrison during the Beatles, George Harrison after the Beatles, like has that whole sound of this George Harrison type feel to it. I think. Yeah, their album Transmitter that came out this year is so awesome. The melodies are awesome. Very tight, well-structured songs and great hooks and melodies and just really good. So Cutworms, Transmitter, their new album. Totally check that out. Well, thank you guys for joining me for this. If you like the Beatles, check these bands out. Please check all of them out and tell me what you think in the comments. If you have more recommendations and you think, I can't believe he didn't talk about this band, then leave them in the comments. I love listening to music. I love finding new music all the time. So I will check out stuff if you tell me to check it out. I made a playlist of all these different of songs from all these different bands that I talked about, and I'm linking it an Apple Music playlist, a Spotify playlist. Both of them are linked in the in the description, so you can click on those, save those, check them out, tell me what you think. Check out our Beatles tier list. I know it was a little lengthy, but I feel like we had good conversation and a lot of good things, interesting things to say about people that didn't grow up with the Beatles but were highly influenced by the Beatles. Check out our game show where we guest Beatles songs, Queen songs, and the band Muse songs as well. Check out my other videos, subscribe. But thanks for joining us on Albino Rhino Music, and we will see you next time.
I like riding my bike at night because I get burned in the broad daylight.